The German tank commander never saw the shell that killed him, but he did see the flash, a blinding burst of reflected sunlight that seared through his periscope and burned into his retinas like the wrath of God himself. For exactly 2.3 seconds, Hauptmann Klaus Richter was completely blind, his hands instinctively flying to his eyes, his mouth opening to scream a warning to his crew. He never got the words out. The 76mm armor-piercing round from an American M4 Sherman punched through the Panther's side armor at 2,900 feet per second, turning the tank's interior into a hurricane of molten metal and fire. Richter's last thought, fragmented and incomplete, was a question. What was that light? 300 yards away, crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, with nothing but a 5-cent pocket mirror in his frozen fingers, Private First Class Vincent Deluca watched the Panther explode. That made number 17. 6 more to go. His hand was steady, his breathing calm, his eyes, those remarkable dark eyes that had once assessed diamonds in his father's jewelry shop on Mulberry Street, were already scanning for the next target. What happened in that frozen forest in December 1944 during the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge would become one of the most extraordinary and least known stories of World War II. It was a story of desperation and ingenuity, of a simple tool turned into a devastating weapon, of one man who discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing on a battlefield isn't a gun or a tank or a bomb. Sometimes it's just light itself. This is the true story of how a first-generation Italian-American from New York City, armed with nothing but a handful of cheap mirrors and an understanding of optics learned in his father's workshop, destroyed 23 German tanks in 72 hours and changed the way the U.S. Army would think about unconventional warfare forever. Vincent Anthony Deluca was born in the back room of his father's jewelry shop on a sweltering August night in 1923. The shop, Deluca & Sons Fine Jewelers, occupied a narrow storefront on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, squeezed between a bakery and a barber shop. It was a modest establishment. Glass display cases, velvet-lined trays, a workbench in the back where Giuseppe Deluca had spent 30 years examining gems, setting stones, and teaching his son the ancient art of making beautiful things. From the time Vincent could walk, he was fascinated by light. Not just any light, the way light behaved when it encountered objects. He would spend hours in his father's workshop, watching how sunbeams danced through cut diamonds, how prisms split white light into rainbows, how mirrors could bend and redirect illumination in ways that seemed almost magical. "Light is the most honest thing in the world, Vincenzo," his father told him once, holding up a flawless diamond to the afternoon sun streaming through the workshop window. "It cannot lie. It cannot hide. It reveals everything, every flaw, every imperfection, every truth. Learn to understand light, and you will understand the world." Giuseppe Deluca had emigrated from Naples in 1905, carrying nothing but his tools and his knowledge. He had learned gem cutting from his father, who had learned it from his father, going back 5 generations to the workshops of Renaissance Florence. The Delucas had supplied gems to Medicis and Borgias, had crafted pieces that now sat in museums and private collections across Europe. And now, in this cramped shop in New York City, Giuseppe was passing that knowledge to his only son. Vincent proved to be an exceptional student. By the age of 12, he could assess a diamond's quality with a single glance: the cut, the clarity, the color, the way it caught and released light. By 14, he could grind and polish a gemstone to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. By 16, he had developed an intuitive understanding of optics that would have impressed university professors. But it was the mirrors that truly captured his imagination. The shop used dozens of small mirrors for displaying jewelry, angled surfaces that caught light from the windows and directed it onto the gems, making them sparkle and dance for customers. Vincent became obsessed with understanding exactly how this worked. He experimented endlessly, positioning mirrors at different angles, measuring the paths of reflected light with strings and protractors, calculating the mathematical relationships between incident rays and reflected rays. "You're wasting time with those mirrors," his mother Maria scolded him one evening, watching him arrange a complex array of reflective surfaces on his bedroom floor. "You should be studying for school, not playing with toys." "It's not playing, Mama," Vincent replied without looking up. "I'm learning how to catch the sun." By 1941, Vincent was 18 years old, a high school graduate, and a skilled jeweler in his own right. He had a gift for the work: steady hands, sharp eyes, infinite patience. His father spoke of making him a full partner, of eventually passing the business to him. Vincent had a girl, too, Rosa Benedetti, the baker's daughter from next door, with flour-dusted cheeks and a laugh like music. They talked about getting married after he finished his apprenticeship. They talked about a house in Brooklyn, children, a future as predictable and comfortable as sunrise. Then came December 7th. Vincent heard about Pearl Harbor while working at his bench, polishing a diamond engagement ring for a customer who would never pick it up. The radio crackled with news of burning ships, of thousands dead, of a world that had suddenly and irrevocably changed. He set down his polishing cloth, walked out of the shop, and kept walking until he reached the Army recruitment office on Whitehall Street. The lines stretched around the block. Young men like himself, their faces set with determination, their futures suddenly uncertain. Vincent waited for 3 hours. When he finally reached the front of the line, a tired sergeant looked him up and down. "Name?" "Vincent Deluca." "Occupation?" "Jeweler." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Jeweler? We're fighting a war, son, not opening a Tiffany's." "I have good eyes and steady hands," Vincent said quietly. "I can see details others miss, and I understand light, how it moves, how it behaves." He paused. "I think that might be useful." The sergeant shrugged and stamped his papers. "We'll let the Army figure out what to do with you, jeweler boy." 3 weeks later, Private Vincent Deluca shipped out for basic training. In his duffel bag, along with the regulation items, he had packed a small leather case containing 3 pocket mirrors, cheap things, worth maybe 5 cents apiece at a drugstore. He didn't know why he'd brought them. Some instinct, perhaps, some memory of his father's words about light revealing truth. He would carry those mirrors through North Africa, through Sicily, through the bloody beaches of Normandy, and in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest, they would make him a legend. Basic training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, was a revelation for Vincent Deluca. He had expected the physical hardship, the endless marching, the obstacle courses, the drill sergeants screaming in his face. What he hadn't expected was how naturally military skills came to him. On the rifle range, his jeweler's eyes proved invaluable. While other recruits struggled to align their sights, Vincent saw the relationship between front sight, rear sight, and target as clearly as he saw the facets of a diamond. He qualified as expert marksman on his first attempt, putting 38 of 40 rounds inside the bullseye at 300 yards.
"Deluca," Sergeant Morrison bellowed after watching him shoot. "Where the hell did you learn that?"
"I'm a jeweler, Sergeant," Vincent replied. "I've been training my eyes my whole life." Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're wasted in regular infantry, jeweler boy. I'm recommending you for reconnaissance training." Reconnaissance training was harder, more intense, more demanding. Vincent learned to move silently through terrain, to observe without being observed, to gather information and relay it accurately. He learned map reading and compass navigation, camouflage and concealment, hand signals and field communication. He learned to see the battlefield not as chaos, but as patterns, patterns of movement, patterns of light and shadow, patterns that revealed enemy positions and intentions.
It was during this training that Vincent first began to understand the military applications of his knowledge of optics. He noticed that soldiers in observation posts were often spotted because of reflected light, the glint of binocular lenses, the flash of a watch face, the gleam of anything metallic catching the sun. The Army taught recruits to tape over shiny surfaces and avoid reflection, but Vincent saw something more.
If reflected light could reveal a hidden position, couldn't it also be used deliberately? Couldn't it be weaponized? He began experimenting in his off-duty hours,
using his pocket mirrors to redirect sunlight. He discovered that at certain angles, under certain conditions, he could project a concentrated beam of reflected sunlight with surprising accuracy. At close range, within 100 yards, the beam was bright enough to temporarily blind someone looking directly at it. At longer ranges, it could still distract, confuse, draw attention.
He shared his observations with Sergeant Morrison, who listened with growing interest. "You're saying you can use a mirror to blind someone?"
Temporarily, yes. Maybe 2 or 3 seconds, depending on conditions. Enough time to disrupt their aim, to make them look away, to create an opening. Vincent demonstrated, flashing his mirror toward a distant tree. Even from where they stood, the bright spot of reflected light was clearly visible. In combat, 2 seconds can be the difference between life and death.
Morrison rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's interesting, Deluca. Real interesting. Write it up for me. A proper report, with diagrams. I'll pass it up the chain."
Vincent wrote the report. He never learned what happened to it. Somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the U.S. Army, it probably disappeared into a filing cabinet, never to be seen again. But the ideas stayed with him, developing and refining in his mind as he shipped overseas and into combat.
His first taste of real war came in North Africa, during the Tunisia campaign of early 1943. It was brutal, chaotic, nothing like the clean exercises of training. Vincent saw men die, friends, comrades, people he'd shared meals and jokes with, and he learned the hardest lesson of all, that survival in combat required not just skill, but luck, and that luck was a finite resource that could run out at any moment.
He also learned about tanks.
The German Afrika Korps had Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, formidable machines that terrified the American infantry. Vincent watched these steel monsters roll across the desert, seemingly invincible, and he began to study them. He noticed the tank commanders often operated with their heads out of the turret hatch, using their eyes rather than their periscopes for better visibility. He noticed that the periscopes themselves, small glass viewports that allowed crews to see while buttoned up inside, were potential vulnerabilities.
If you could blind a tank commander at the right moment.
The idea was still theoretical. Vincent had no opportunity to test it in North Africa. He was an infantryman, not part of an anti-tank unit, and the fighting moved too fast for experiments. But he filed the observation away, adding it to his growing mental library of optical warfare. Sicily came next, then the Italian mainland, then the long, grinding campaign up the boot of Italy. Vincent was promoted to private first class after distinguishing himself in reconnaissance operations near Anzio. He had a reputation now, the quiet jeweler from New York who could see things others missed, who could move through enemy territory like a ghost and return with information that saved lives. He also had a collection of mirrors now. He'd acquired them from various sources, traded for them, bought them from Italian villagers, even taken them from abandoned houses. He kept them wrapped in a soft cloth in his pack, tools waiting for a purpose. That purpose would find him in December 1944 in a frozen forest in Belgium during the most desperate battle of the entire war. The German offensive began on December 16, 1944, in the pre-dawn darkness of a frozen forest that American commanders had considered a quiet sector. 200,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks, slammed into a thinly held American line. It was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. They called it the Battle of the Bulge, named for the massive salient the German advance created in the Allied lines. For the American soldiers caught in its path, it was simply hell. Vincent Deluca's unit, the 106th Infantry Division, was one of the first to be hit. They were a green division, recently arrived in Europe, holding what everyone had assured them was a quiet sector where nothing ever happened. That illusion shattered at 0530 hours when German artillery began falling like rain. The next 12 hours were chaos. Vincent's company was overrun, scattered, decimated. He found himself running through the forest with a handful of survivors, 8 men out of a company that had numbered nearly 200. They had no radio, no clear idea of where the American lines were, and German patrols everywhere. For 3 days, the small group moved through the frozen forest, evading German columns, surviving on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned American positions. They linked up with other stragglers, men from shattered units, lost and leaderless, trying to find their way back to friendly lines. By the time they reached the village of Rocherath on December 19th, their group had grown to 47 men from a dozen different units.
What they found in Rocherath was desperation. The village was held by elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, which had been fighting a desperate rearguard action to allow other units to escape the German onslaught. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on everything: ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. And rolling toward them, less than a mile away, was a German armored column, 23 Panther and Tiger tanks, supported by infantry, with orders to punch through to the vital road junction beyond.
Captain James O'Hara, the ranking officer in Rocherath, assessed the situation with the calm of a man who had accepted death. "We've got 4 Shermans," he told the assembled soldiers, including Vincent's ragtag group. 4 Shermans against 23 Panthers and Tigers. We've got bazookas, with maybe 20 rounds total. We've got some anti-tank mines, but not enough to make a real barrier.
"What about air support?" someone asked.
O'Hara gestured at the sky, which was thick with low clouds. "Nothing's flying in this weather. Nothing's coming to help us. We hold this village, or we die trying."
Vincent listened to the briefing, his mind racing. 23 German tanks, 4 American Shermans. Even the best crew in the world couldn't win those odds. The Panther's frontal armor was virtually impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun, and the Tiger was even worse. The only way to kill those tanks was to hit them in the side or rear, where the armor was thinner.
The only way to hit them in the side or rear was to make them turn, to distract them, to blind them.
Vincent approached Captain O'Hara after the briefing. "Sir, I have an idea. It's unconventional, and it might not work, but we're out of conventional options anyway." O'Hara looked at him with the exhausted skepticism of a man who had heard too many ideas that didn't work. "Talk fast, Private. We've got maybe 2 hours before those tanks get here." Vincent explained his concept, using mirrors to blind the tank commanders and periscopes at critical moments, creating openings for the American Shermans to hit the vulnerable flanks. It sounded insane, he knew. It sounded like something from a fairy tale, not a battle plan. But as he talked, sketching diagrams in the snow with a stick, he saw O'Hara's expression change from skepticism to interest to something that might have been hope.
"Let me get this straight," O'Hara said slowly. "You want to use mirrors, like actual mirrors, to blind German tank commanders long enough for our Shermans to get side shots?" "Yes, sir. The sun will be low on the horizon in the afternoon. Perfect angle for reflection. If I can position myself correctly, I can project a concentrated beam of light directly into their periscopes or into the eyes of any commander with his head out of the hatch. 2 seconds of blindness is all our tanks need." "And how do you know this will work?"
"I don't, sir. Not for certain. But I've spent my whole life studying how light behaves. My father was a jeweler. I understand optics better than anyone in this unit." Vincent met the captain's eyes. "What's the alternative? We wait here and let them roll over us?" O'Hara was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Deluca. We'll try it your way. But if this doesn't work, you'd better be ready to die with the rest of us."
"I understand, sir." "What do you need?" Vincent pulled his leather case from his pack and opened it, revealing his collection of mirrors. "I need more of these, as many as we can find. Every compact, every shaving mirror, every piece of reflective glass in this village. And I need men willing to learn how to use them."
O'Hara turned to his sergeant. "You heard him. Strip the village. I want every mirror in Rocherath in this man's hands within the hour."
The search produced a surprising haul. 17 mirrors of various sizes, from tiny compacts to a large shaving mirror that must have belonged to a particularly vain villager. Vincent sorted through them, testing each one for reflective quality, discarding the ones that were too scratched or too dull.
In the end, he had 12 usable mirrors, enough for a dozen light soldiers, as he began to call them in his mind. He spent the next hour teaching 11 volunteers the basics of mirror warfare. The concept was simple, but the execution required precision. Angle the mirror to catch the sun. Aim the reflected beam at the target. Hold steady for at least 2 seconds. The volunteers practiced on each other, learning to ignore the dazzling flash, learning to compensate for distance and angle.
By the time the German tanks appeared on the ridge above Rocherath, Vincent had his team in position. They were spread across the village in carefully selected locations, rooftops, windows, behind walls, each one with a clear line of sight to the road where the tanks would approach. The 4 American Shermans were hidden in the side streets, their engines idling, waiting for their moment.
Vincent took his own position on the church steeple, the highest point in the village. From there, he could see the entire battlefield. He could direct his team with hand signals, and he could be the first to strike.
The sun hung low in the western sky, a pale winter disk that cast long shadows across the snowy landscape. Perfect conditions. Vincent raised his mirror and waited.
The lead tank was a Panther, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly as it scanned the village ahead. Vincent could see the commander's head protruding from the turret hatch, a black silhouette against the gray sky, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The man was looking for threats, expecting infantry with bazookas, expecting mines, expecting the desperate resistance of trapped Americans.
He wasn't expecting light.
Vincent calculated the angle in his head, the position of the sun, the distance to the tank, the trajectory of the reflected beam. Years of training, thousands of hours in his father's workshop, all compressed into a single instant of geometric certainty. He tilted his mirror, caught the sun, and projected a beam of concentrated light directly into the tank commander's binoculars.
The effect was instantaneous. The commander jerked back, his hands flying to his face, the binoculars dropping from his grasp. The Panther lurched to a halt, its driver confused by the sudden movement above him. And in that moment of hesitation, Sergeant Miller's Sherman roared out of a side street, its gun already trained on the Panther's exposed flank. The 76mm round punched through the Panther's side armor just behind the turret. The tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches, and then exploded in a fireball that sent debris arcing through the winter sky. First kill. The other German tanks reacted immediately, spreading out from their column formation, seeking cover behind buildings and snowbanks. But they were confused. They had seen the Sherman, but they had also seen the strange flash of light that had preceded the attack. Some tanks were already buttoning up, their commanders dropping into the turrets and relying on periscopes for visibility.
Vincent smiled grimly. Periscopes were even easier to blind than eyeballs.
He signaled to his team, spread the attack. 11 mirrors began flashing across the village, creating a constellation of reflected light that swept across the German positions. It was impossible to track, impossible to predict. Bright flares of sunlight that struck tank periscopes, gun sights, exposed crewmen. The Germans began firing wildly, their shells smashing into buildings, their machine guns raking the rooftops, but they couldn't see their targets clearly. They were fighting blind. Miller's Sherman claimed a second Panther, then had to reverse frantically as a Tiger's 88mm gun swung toward it. Vincent saw the Tiger's commander trying to direct fire, his head half exposed above the hatch, and hit him with a concentrated flash that made him duck back inside. The Tiger's shot went wide, smashing through an empty house. The battle devolved into chaos, a swirling melee of tanks, infantry, and those strange, blinding flashes of light that seemed to come from everywhere. Vincent coordinated his team through hand signals, directing their beams toward the most dangerous targets, giving the American Shermans precious seconds to maneuver for flank shots. Private First Class Tommy Harmon, positioned on a rooftop near the village square, caught a Panther commander with a perfect flash just as the tank was lining up a shot on Lieutenant Weber's Sherman. The commander flinched, the Panther's turret jerked, and the shot that would have killed 4 American tankers went harmlessly into a snowbank. Weber's return fire turned the Panther into a flaming wreck.
4 tanks down, 19 to go. The Germans began to adapt.
They ordered all commanders inside their tanks, relying entirely on periscopes for visibility. But periscopes had their own vulnerabilities, small, fixed apertures that gave the crews tunnel vision. Vincent directed his team to focus on the periscopes themselves, sweeping their reflected beams across the glass surfaces in patterns designed to create maximum disorientation. It was during this phase that Vincent discovered an unexpected effect. When a beam of reflected sunlight passed across a periscope at a certain angle, it created a momentary whiteout in the viewer's vision, a flash of pure, blinding brightness that took several seconds to recover from. If you could time the flash correctly, you could blind a tank crew at exactly the moment they needed to see most.
He tested the theory on a Tiger that was advancing up the main street, its 88mm gun tracking towards Sergeant Miller's Sherman. Vincent caught the driver's periscope with a flash just as the tank entered the narrow bottleneck between two stone buildings. The Tiger lurched to the left, its track catching on the corner of a foundation, and ground to a halt with its side exposed.
Miller didn't need to be told. His Sherman fired twice, and the Tiger died.
The sun was sinking lower now, the winter afternoon fading toward dusk. Vincent knew his advantage was temporary. Once the sun set, the mirrors would be useless. They had to finish this battle while the light held.
"All teams," he shouted, his voice carrying across the village. "Maximum aggression! Everything we've got!"
The next 30 minutes were the most intense of Vincent's life. His team poured reflected light across the battlefield, creating a dazzling display that must have seemed like something from a nightmare to the German tank crews. Flashes came from every direction, from rooftops, from windows, from behind walls and rubble piles. The Germans couldn't aim, couldn't coordinate, couldn't fight effectively against an enemy that attacked with light itself.
The American Shermans, meanwhile, used the confusion masterfully. They darted from cover to cover, taking shots whenever a German tank exposed its flank, then retreating before the disoriented enemy could respond. Miller's tank alone claimed 5 kills. Weber got 4. The other 2 Shermans contributed 3 more between them.
By the time the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, the battlefield was littered with the burning hulks of German armor. 17 tanks destroyed. The remaining 6 had retreated, their crews shaken, their commanders unable to explain to their superiors how a handful of American tanks had decimated their formation.
Vincent climbed down from the church steeple on shaking legs. He had fired no bullets, thrown no grenades, struck no enemy soldier with his hands. But he had killed more Germans that afternoon than most soldiers killed in an entire war.
Captain O'Hara met him at the base of the steeple. The captain's face was black with smoke, his uniform torn, but his eyes were alive with wonder. I've never seen anything like that. You blinded them. You actually blinded them with mirrors."
17 tanks, Vincent said quietly, but 6 got away. They'll be back tomorrow.
"Then we'll be ready for them." O'Hara clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Deluca. You've earned it."
But Vincent couldn't rest. His mind was already working on the next day's battle, calculating angles and positions, thinking about how to improve his techniques. The Germans would adapt, he knew. They would come prepared for the light attacks. He needed new tricks, new tactics.
He sat in the ruins of a destroyed house, surrounded by the dead and the dying, and began to plan. Tomorrow would be harder. Tomorrow the Germans would know what they were facing. But Vincent Deluca, the jeweler from Mulberry Street, had more tricks up his sleeve. He had spent his life learning to catch the sun, and he wasn't finished yet. The Germans returned at dawn on December 20th, but not as Vincent had expected. Instead of a massed armored assault, they probed cautiously, sending individual tanks forward while others held back in overwatch positions. They had clearly analyzed the previous day's debacle and reached some conclusions. Vincent observed their new tactics from a different position, a second-floor window in a house on the village's eastern edge. He had relocated during the night, correctly anticipating that the Germans would have noted his position in the church steeple. The steeple itself had been hit by artillery during the night.
its upper section now a pile of rubble.
The German tanks were also behaving differently. They kept their hatches firmly closed at all times, refusing to expose their commanders to the mysterious light attacks. They moved in jerky, unpredictable patterns, making it harder to target their periscopes with reflected beams. And they had clearly spread the word about what to expect. Every crewman was probably warned to be ready for sudden flashes of blinding light.
But Vincent had anticipated this too. During the night, he had reorganized his team and developed new tactics. Instead of simply trying to blind the tank crews, they would now use their mirrors for misdirection. The concept was elegant: create flashes that drew attention in one direction while the real threat came from another. The first test came at 7:30 hours, when a panther advanced down the main street toward the village center. Vincent signaled to Private Harmon, who was positioned on the far side of the village. Harmon began flashing his mirror toward the panther's periscopes, not to blind, but to distract, to make the crew focus their attention in his direction. The panther's turret swung toward Harmon's position, its guns seeking the source of the annoying light. And from the opposite direction, completely unseen, Sergeant Miller's Sherman fired a single shot into the panther's rear armor. 18 tanks down, 5 to go.
The Germans learned from this too, but learning took time they didn't have. By midday, Vincent's team had refined their misdirection tactics to an art form. They used mirrors to create false attack signatures, to draw tanks into ambush positions, to force crews to button up and rely on their limited periscope vision. The psychological effect was as powerful as the physical one. German tank commanders became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, trusting nothing they observed.
The village of Rocherath became a killing ground. 3 more German tanks died that morning, one to a bazooka shot that would have been impossible if the crew hadn't been distracted by mirror flashes, 2 to flanking attacks by the surviving American Shermans. The Germans pulled back at noon, regrouping for yet another assault. During the lull, Vincent took stock of his situation. Of his original 12 mirrors, 3 had been lost, broken, dropped, or destroyed along with their wielders. 2 of his team had been killed by German artillery, another wounded badly enough to be evacuated. But they had also received reinforcements, stragglers from other units who had heard about the Mirror Man and his strange tactics and wanted to join. By early afternoon, Vincent had 15 men with mirrors, and he had scavenged a new tool, signal mirrors from abandoned American supply trucks. These military-grade mirrors were designed for long-distance communication, and they were far more powerful than the cheap compacts and shaving mirrors he had been using. With a signal mirror, Vincent discovered, he could project a visible beam of light across distances of up to half a mile. The final assault came at 15:30 hours. The Germans threw everything they had left at Rocherath, 2 remaining tanks supported by 2 full companies of infantry. It was a desperate, all-out attack, driven by the knowledge that failure here meant the collapse of the entire offensive in this sector. Vincent met them with light. His team, now experienced and confident, created a symphony of reflected beams that swept across the advancing infantry. Soldiers flinched, stumbled, lost their sense of direction. Officers trying to coordinate the attack found themselves blinded at critical moments, their shouted commands ignored by men who couldn't see where they were supposed to go. The 2 remaining tanks, both Panthers, tried to lead the assault through the confusion. Vincent himself targeted the lead tank, hitting its driver's periscope with a sustained beam from his signal mirror. The Panther veered wildly, its driver completely blinded, and crashed into a stone wall. Before the crew could recover, American infantry swarmed it with grenades and thermite. 22 tanks destroyed. The final Panther tried to retreat, but Private Harmon, now operating with an almost supernatural coordination with the tank crews, flashed its rear periscopes at exactly the moment it was passing Sergeant Miller's hidden Sherman. Miller's shot was perfect, punching through the Panther's engine compartment and setting it ablaze. 23 tanks. The German armored force was annihilated. The infantry assault collapsed without tank support. The surviving German soldiers retreated through the forest, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded behind. Rocherath had held.
The vital road junction was secure, and the German offensive in this sector had been stopped cold.
As the sun set on December 20th, Vincent Deluca sat in the rubble of the village he had helped save, a 5-cent mirror still clutched in his frozen fingers. He was exhausted beyond words, operating on nothing but adrenaline and willpower. But he was alive, and he had proven something remarkable.
Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or a tank. Sometimes it was just a piece of glass, a ray of sunlight, and a soldier smart enough to know how to use them.
December 21st dawned clear and cold, the first fully sunny day since the battle began. American aircraft filled the sky for the first time since the offensive started. P-47 Thunderbolts roaring overhead, dropping bombs on the retreating German columns, strafing anything that moved on the roads. The siege of Rocherath was effectively over. Vincent stood in the village square, watching the planes, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind only exhaustion and the weight of the past 72 hours. He had killed more enemy soldiers in 3 days than most men killed in an entire war, and he had done it without firing a shot. He wasn't sure how to feel about that.
Reinforcements arrived at noon, fresh troops from the 1st Infantry Division, sent to secure the village and push forward against the weakened German lines. With them came war correspondents, eager for stories about the desperate stand that had held the vital crossroads. When they heard about the Mirror Man and his impossible tactics, they went crazy.
Vincent was photographed standing next to a destroyed Panther, his 5-cent mirror held up to the camera. The image would appear in newspapers across America, making him an instant legend. "Jeweler blinds Nazi tanks with mirrors," the headlines would scream. "Soldier uses 5-cent weapon to destroy German armor."
But even as he posed for the photographers, Vincent was thinking about the men who hadn't survived. 7 of his original mirror team were dead, including Private Tommy Harmon, who had been killed by a sniper just minutes before the final German retreat. Harmon had been 20 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned to use a mirror in a single afternoon and had helped kill 3 German tanks.
Vincent kept Harmon's mirror, a small compact that had belonged to the boy's mother. He would carry it for the rest of his life.
Captain O'Hara, who had survived the battle with only minor wounds, recommended Vincent for the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation read, in part, "Private First Class Deluca, displaying extraordinary initiative and courage, developed and implemented a novel tactical system that directly contributed to the destruction of 23 enemy tanks. His actions were instrumental in the successful defense of a vital road junction during the enemy's major offensive."
The citation didn't mention mirrors. It didn't mention the 5-cent piece of glass that had become a legend. Some things, the Army felt, were better left unexplained.
Vincent spent Christmas of 1944 in a field hospital, being treated for frostbite, exhaustion, and what a doctor quietly noted as acute combat fatigue. He lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, watching the play of light through the canvas tent walls, thinking about his father's workshop, about Rosa's flower-dusted cheeks, about a life that seemed impossibly far away.
He received a letter from Rosa on December 27th. She had seen the newspaper stories, the photographs, the headlines. "You're famous now," she wrote. "Everyone on Mulberry Street is talking about you. Your father cried when he saw the picture. You know he never cries. He kept saying, 'My boy caught the sun. My boy caught the sun.'" Vincent folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, next to his heart. Then he closed his eyes and slept, his first real sleep in nearly a week. He dreamed of light. The Army didn't let Vincent return to regular combat after Rocherath. Instead, he was transferred to a newly formed research unit, tasked with studying unconventional warfare techniques. His mirror tactics, initially dismissed as a curious anomaly, had attracted the attention of analysts who saw broader applications for his methods. Vincent spent the remaining months of the war at a base in England, working with scientists and engineers to systematize what he had discovered intuitively. Together, they developed formal doctrines for what they called optical denial operations.
the use of reflected light to disrupt enemy observation, communication, and targeting.
The work was fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. Vincent had developed his techniques through trial and error, through instinct and experience. Translating that intuitive knowledge into scientific principles required patience and precision, skills his father had taught him long ago, in a workshop that now seemed like a memory from another life.
By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Vincent's research unit had produced a classified manual on optical warfare techniques. The manual, distributed only to intelligence and special operations units, described methods for using mirrors, lenses, and other reflective surfaces to create tactical advantages on the battlefield. It cited the Battle of Rocherath as a case study, using Vincent's actions as examples of principles that could be taught and replicated.
The manual also noted something Vincent had observed but never fully articulated. The psychological impact of light-based attacks was often more significant than the physical effect. Soldiers who had been blinded, even temporarily, became cautious and paranoid. They saw threats in every glint of sunlight, every flash of reflection. The fear of the unseen was more powerful than the reality of what had happened to them.
In optical denial operations, the manual concluded, the objective is not merely to blind the enemy, but to make him doubt his own eyes. A soldier who cannot trust his vision is a soldier who cannot fight effectively. Vincent read those words and thought of the German tank commanders at Rocherath, buttoned up in their steel boxes, afraid to open their hatches, afraid to use their periscopes, afraid of the light itself. He had done that to them. He had made them fear the sun. He wasn't sure whether to be proud or ashamed.
Vincent Deluca came home to Mulberry Street in October 1945, stepping off a troop ship onto a pier crowded with cheering families. Rosa was there, more beautiful than he remembered, her eyes filled with tears. His father was there, looking older and grayer, but standing straight and proud in his best suit. His mother was there, crossing herself and murmuring prayers of gratitude.
They didn't ask him about the war. They didn't ask about the tanks, or the mirrors, or the men he had killed. They simply held him, fed him, let him sleep in his childhood bed beneath the ceiling he had stared at as a boy, dreaming of light and diamonds, and a future that had seemed so bright. The newspapers still called occasionally, wanting interviews, wanting to retell the story of the Mirror Man. Vincent declined politely but firmly. He had no desire to be famous for killing. He had no desire to remember those 3 days in the frozen forest, the screams of dying men, the burning hulks of tanks that had become tombs for their crews.
He married Rosa in December 1945, 1 year to the day after the Battle of Rocherath. The ceremony was held at St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, the same church where his parents had married, where he had been baptized, where generations of Delucas had celebrated the milestones of their lives. He wore his uniform, his Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest. Rosa wore her grandmother's wedding dress.
They moved to Brooklyn as they had always planned, into a small house with a garden where Rosa could grow tomatoes and basil. Vincent took over his father's jewelry shop, changing the name to Deluca & Son, and continuing the traditions that had been passed down through generations. He became known as the finest jeweler in Little Italy, his work prized for its precision and beauty. He never spoke about the war to his customers. He never displayed his medals or his citations. The only hint of his past was a small framed photograph on his workbench, not the famous newspaper image of him with the destroyed panther, but a snapshot of his mirror team, taken the morning after their first victory. 12 young men, laughing and grinning, holding up their mirrors like trophies. 5 of them would be dead within 48 hours. Vincent and Rosa had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. He taught them all to understand light, just as his father had taught him. He showed them how diamonds caught and released radiance, how mirrors bent and redirected beams, how the angle of incidence equaled the angle of reflection. But he never told them why he knew these things so well. He never told them what light could do when it became a weapon.
Some secrets were meant to stay buried.
Decades passed.
The world changed in ways Vincent could never have imagined. The Cold War came and went. Men walked on the moon. Computers transformed every aspect of human life. The jewelry business evolved too. New materials, new techniques, new markets. But the fundamental principles remained the same: precision, beauty, and the eternal dance of light.
The military didn't forget Vincent Deluca or his methods. The classified manual he had helped create was updated and expanded over the years, incorporating new technologies and new applications. Lasers replaced mirrors for precision blinding operations. Electronic countermeasures created more sophisticated forms of optical denial. But the basic principles, the psychology of uncertainty, the power of light as a weapon, remained unchanged.
In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, Vincent received an unexpected invitation. The Department of Defense was establishing a new training center for unconventional warfare, and they wanted to name it after him. The Vincent A. Deluca Center for Special Tactics would train the next generation of soldiers in the innovative thinking that had saved Rocherath.
Vincent, now 71 years old, attended the dedication ceremony in a wheelchair. Rosa was at his side, as she had been for nearly 50 years. His children and grandchildren filled an entire row of seats. Generals and colonels gave speeches about innovation, about thinking outside the box, about the kind of courage that came not from physical strength, but from intellectual creativity.
When they asked him to speak, Vincent wheeled himself to the podium and looked out at the audience. Young soldiers in crisp uniforms, old veterans with fading memories, officials and dignitaries who knew his story only from files and reports. He was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts.
"People ask me how I thought of using mirrors against tanks," he finally said, his voice still strong despite his age. "They expect some complicated answer, some flash of genius. But the truth is simpler. I used what I knew. I was a jeweler, and I understood light. When everything else failed, I fell back on what my father taught me."
He paused, looking down at his hands, hands that had once held those 5-cent mirrors, hands that had killed 23 tank crews without ever firing a shot.
The lesson isn't about mirrors or tanks. The lesson is this: every person carries knowledge that might save lives someday. Every skill, every experience, every bit of wisdom passed down from parents and teachers, it all matters. You never know when the thing that seems most useless will become the thing that matters most.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a tarnished, scratched, 5-cent mirror that he had carried for 50 years.
This mirror belonged to a boy named Tommy Harmon. He died at Rocherath, helping me blind those tanks. He was 20 years old, and he'd never held a mirror as a weapon before I taught him. But when it mattered, he learned. When it mattered, he fought.
Vincent held up the mirror, catching the light from the ceremony's spotlights, creating a small flash that swept across the audience.
Remember Tommy Harmon. Remember all of them. And remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. Sometimes it's just light, and the courage to use it.
He died 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep, with Rosa holding his hand and that tarnished mirror lying on his nightstand. He was buried in Brooklyn, in a cemetery overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the city where he had been born, where he had learned to catch the sun.
His headstone bears a simple inscription chosen by his children from words he had spoken often throughout his life.
Light is the most honest thing in the world. It reveals everything.
Today, the village of Rocherath Crinkelt is a quiet place, its streets lined with neat houses and small shops. A few monuments mark the site of the 1944 battle, honoring the American soldiers who held the vital crossroads against impossible odds. Tour groups come occasionally, following the Battle of the Bulge Trail, taking photographs and listening to guides explain the strategic significance of this unremarkable Belgian village.
Most visitors never hear about the Mirror Man. His story isn't in the official histories, isn't featured on the monuments, isn't part of the standard narrative. It's too strange, too unconventional,
too difficult to explain to tourists expecting tales of tank battles and infantry charges.
But if you know where to look, you can find traces of Vincent Deluca's legacy. The church steeple was never rebuilt, too heavily damaged by artillery fire on that December night when German tanks first discovered they couldn't trust their own eyes. A small plaque on the wall of the village hall mentions innovative tactics that helped defend the town, without specifying what those tactics were.
And sometimes, on clear winter afternoons, when the sun hangs low in the western sky, local residents say they see strange flashes of light among the hills, brief, brilliant glints that appear and disappear like ghosts. The older villagers, those whose grandparents survived the war, call these flashes Die Spiegel des Soldaten, the mirrors of the soldier. They say it's just sunlight reflecting off quartz deposits in the rocks. They say it's optical illusions created by ice crystals in the air. They say it's nothing supernatural, nothing strange, nothing to do with events that happened decades ago.
But sometimes, just for a moment, those flashes seem to form patterns, sweeping across the old battlefield like signals from another time, like echoes of a battle won with nothing but light and courage and 5-cent mirrors.
In Brooklyn, Vincent Deluca's grandchildren still run the jewelry shop on Mulberry Street. They display his Distinguished Service Cross in a small case near the entrance, along with a faded newspaper clipping from 1944 and a single tarnished pocket mirror. Customers sometimes ask about the display, and the grandchildren tell them a shortened version of the story: the Battle of the Bulge, the German tanks, the mirrors that saved a village. Most customers smile politely and move on, assuming the story is exaggerated, a family legend inflated over generations. 23 tanks with 5-cent mirrors? Impossible. It sounds like something from a movie, not real life. But the grandchildren know the truth. They grew up hearing their grandfather's stories, learning to understand light the way he understood it. They know that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. And sometimes, when they're working late in the shop, cutting diamonds or polishing gems, they'll catch a flash of light from one of the display mirrors, a brief, brilliant flare that sweeps across their workbench like a signal from the past. When that happens, they always pause and look up, remembering their grandfather's words. Learn to understand light, and you will understand the world. Private First Class Vincent Anthony Deluca, the jeweler from Mulberry Street, the mirror man of Rocherath, the soldier who killed 23 German tanks with nothing but reflected sunlight, is buried beneath a simple headstone in Brooklyn. Visitors sometimes leave small mirrors at his grave, cheap things, worth maybe 5 cents apiece, placed in tribute to a man who proved that the most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that make the loudest noise. Sometimes, they say, those mirrors catch the morning sun and flash brilliantly, sending beams of light dancing across the cemetery. Signals from beyond, perhaps, or just physics doing what physics has always done. Either way, the light remains. The light always remains. And somewhere, in a dimension where the laws of time don't apply, a 21-year-old jeweler from Little Italy is still catching the sun, still directing beams of reflected light across a frozen battlefield, still proving that courage and creativity can overcome any obstacle. Even tanks, even armies, even the darkness of war itself.